In this video, I'm going to talk all about choosing the right focal length in your landscape photography. Right, don't drop them. Big thanks to Squarespace for sponsoring this week's video. Morning everybody, fantastic to see you all again. So I've just got this lens here, which is the 70-200 Z lens from Nikon, and it's replaced my 16-year-old version of this for my SLR camera. This is the mirrorless version, and early indications are it's absolutely amazing. It's not going to change my photography massively, but it's nice to have the latest version. But it got me thinking about focal lengths and how I use focal lengths in my landscape photography and when I use particular focal lengths. So what I'm going to do is talk all about that in this video. And quite often as landscape photographers, we're presented with a scene like this, where I've got a choice of focal length, so we could choose to shoot a really wide angle focal length like 14mm, or we could go in a little bit closer and shoot at 24mm maybe, or maybe we could start to pick out a little bit of the scene and shoot at 35mm, or a little bit closer and shoot at maybe 50 or 70mm, or even closer still and go for something like 100 or 150mm. And they're all valid. You know, you can use all of them and shoot a great shot, but sometimes it's good to choose one over another, and sometimes it's good to know when to do that. Why should you shoot 18mm over 21mm, or why 35 over 60? And a lot of it comes down to it, of course, to composition, but it also comes down to some other factors as well. And what I want to do is start at 14mm and go all the way up to 200mm, and explain how I choose particular focal lengths and give you some examples of when I'd use one focal length over another. And then right at the end, which is really interesting, I can show you the focal lengths that I use most often in my portfolio shots. I can look at the stats in Lightroom and show you the focal length that I use most often. And it really surprised me actually. Okay, so before we get into the 14mm, I just want to say a little bit about focus and a little bit about how our eyes see. So our eyes have quite a wide field of view actually. Our field of view is probably around about 21mm. But it's a bit strange really, and I'll link an article below which explains this in a little bit more detail. But what we're actually focusing on, quite literally, is the middle sort of 50mm of the frame. Even though we can see we've got more peripheral view to probably around about 20mm, the thing that we see and how we see a scene is usually around sort of between 40 and 55mm. So quite often when we look at something that's maybe 24mm, it looks wider than we perceive it. And I think that's interesting to note and interesting to maybe refer back to as we go through the different focal lengths. And then the other thing I wanted to speak about is depth of field, because depth of field often plays a big role in choosing a focal length. So for instance, if you want to include some foreground that's quite close to you, then you're probably not going to use a 70mm focal length, because you're going to really struggle. As well as not having the right field of view, you're probably not going to get the depth of field with that 70mm, because what some people don't realize is that the longer you go with your focal length, the shorter your depth of field is. And I did a video all about focus, I'll link it here. But you can see in this table, if we just look at the different focal lengths, then if we focus on infinity at f9, then everything on a 14mm focal length is in focus or acceptable focus, up to about 70 centimeters away. So it's really easy with a 40mm lens to get everything in focus. You don't often have to focus stack. But as you go up in focal length and go to a longer lens, then at 24mm, everything from an infinity to 2 meters is acceptably sharp at f9. When you focus on infinity, but when you get up to sort of 70mm, then it's difficult to get everything in the scene if you've got things closer to you in focus, and you've got to start to make compromises there, especially if you're shooting sort of woodland or something where you've got things closer to you. You've got to think, which tree do I want in focus, or am I happy to have the furthest trees slightly out of focus? Usually that's the case, but you've got to start to make those decisions with your focal length choices. So that's something interesting to note, and it's quite often why I like shooting with a wide focal length, because I can get more in focus. And then the other thing you've got to remember with focal length is scale. And we'll talk about this as we go through the various focal lengths. But obviously at a wide angle, then it's difficult to get an idea of scale of mountains in the distance, because they come very small within the scene. And often you've either got to include people or cars or buildings to depict that scale. Whereas with a long lens, you can sort of compress the scene, you can make those mountains seem bigger. So scale is a big element of choosing your focal length as well, and something that's really important to think about when you're deciding on which lens, whether you're going for your big long lens or you're going for your wide angle lens. Okay, let's get into the first set of focal lengths, and that's ultra wide, between around 14 and 18 millimeters. Most people have got an ultra wide lens, either something like a 16 to 35 or a 14 to 30 or something like that. In my case, I got this 14 to 30 lens, which is fantastic. Now, you've got to be super careful when you're using ultra wide, because it includes so much of the scene. And if you're including a lot of the scene, then you've got to be careful about where you place all those elements. So often composition is much more difficult with an ultra wide lens than it is with a longer lens. Take this scene, for instance. It's a lot of things in this scene, and it's a lot of nothing really, and it doesn't really work as an image. Okay, it looks okay, but the mountains sort of disappear in the top right corner. There's no strong foreground element, and it really doesn't work properly. Whereas this one, at 14 millimeters on the Isle of Skye, where I've included some really definite foreground, works a lot better. You can see that the foreground's very dominant, but what you can also see is those mountains in the background have started to disappear. If I'd have zoomed in a little bit further on this particular scene and gone to maybe sort of 20 millimeters like this, you can see that the foreground's probably not quite as dominant, but the mountains become more part of the scene. And we'll talk about that in the next section in a bit more detail. But it's interesting at this ultra wide end, because actually those 1 or 2 millimeters can make such a big difference. So for instance, take this shot here. This is at 16 millimeters in the Faroe Islands on Kalsoy, where there's this amazing sea cliff which just comes out of the ocean. It's so stunning with this lighthouse. It's a very famous scene. But at 16 millimeters right on the peninsula, I can only just get it in if I want to have some foreground. Now obviously I could have turned the camera up a little bit, but you really need to go to 14 millimeters on this scene. When I went back, and you can see it's a completely different time of the year now, the grass is really lush and green, but I managed with that 14 millimeters, just those extra 2 millimeters, to get more in the scene. So quite often, those extra millimeters can make a really big difference if you're really close to a big mountain, like you often are in the Faroes or Iceland or Scotland. But you do need to be close with those ultra wide angle lenses. If you're too far away, then the mountains just look so far and so distant, like that first shot that I showed you. You don't really know what you're trying to look at in the scene. So what I try to do when I've got a wide angle lens is try to shoot with it when I feel I've got foreground that's quite close to a big mountain in the distance. And it's quite often difficult to visualize because your eyes aren't seeing in that super wide angle vision. So usually I'll get my phone and put it on its wide angle, which is really useful with the iPhone and the new Samsungs. They've got a wide angle lens. Or I'll put the wide angle lens on, go to 14 millimeters and look through my camera. And here's a couple of examples. So this is one at Stockness in Iceland, and you can see I've got these grasses in and the mountains in the distance. Now those mountains were quite dominant above me in this scene, but when I've got this 14 millimeter lens on, you can see that they become quite small. Again, this one in the Faroe Islands, you can see the sea stack here, which again was very dominant in front of me, becomes looks okay in the scene and balances really well with the foreground, but I'm quite close to it. So it's something to really think about when you're shooting with an ultra wide angle lens. Okay, on to the next set of ranges, and that's between about 18 and 24 millimeters. And I feel like these are probably the easiest wide angle focal lengths to work with. I think it's a little bit easier to work with 14 millimeters. You're starting to see it easier with your eyes, and you can start to spot compositions a little bit easier as well. And also, when you get up to 24 millimeters, you've still got wide angle, but you don't really get the mountains being so small in the distance. So you don't have to be as close to those mountains to make them look proportionately right in the scene. So take this one here, you can see this was in Torridon in Scotland. I've got some nice rocks. This was shot at 20 millimeters. I've got the rocks in the foreground, but the mountains aren't looking too small in the background, and I've got some mid-ground, and it just looks okay. If I shot this at 14 millimeters, I'd have had a huge amount of foreground or a huge amount of sky, and it probably wouldn't have quite worked for this particular scene because the mountains were too far away in the distance. Again, this shot is very similar to that from Lofoten. I managed to get a scene that looks quite nice. It's a nice vista. I haven't got too much foreground or too much sky, and everything is in proportion in the scene. When I'm shooting at something like 24 millimeters, I'm thinking of shooting at that focal length when I haven't got any dominant foreground that I want to have in the scene. There might be a foreground, but it won't be super dominant. It won't be the focus of attention in the scene. And it's where I really want to balance that foreground and that distant mountain. So for instance, this one here from the Peak District, I've got this wall, I've got these mid-ground trees and the hut and then the sky. And by using a 24 millimeter lens, I can sort of balance that really well within the scene. Again, if I'd have used something any wider than that, it wouldn't have really worked, and the hut and the trees would have just disappeared into nothing. Again, this shot here in the Faroe Islands of this stunning sea stacks again, you can actually see on this, believe it or not, a massive slab of this probably, I don't know, 100-meter high sea cliff had fallen off since the year before that we'd gone. That must have been some event. I mean, these waves get really big. But in this one, I didn't want to accentuate the foreground so much. I shot at 24 millimeters. I've got some foreground, some mid-ground, and it all sort of balances together. It's a really nice focal length to create what I call a standard vista, I suppose. Okay, we're now moving on to mid-range, the sort of 30 to 60 millimeters, you know, what you would shoot with your 24 to 70 millimeter lens. And, you know, if I'm shooting with this, which is a super versatile lens, then I'm quite often shooting between that sort of 30 to 60, 70 millimeter range. And it's a really interesting focal range because it allows you to just focus in a little bit more in the composition and have more control over your composition in landscape photography. I definitely recommend, you know, this as a lens to start with in landscape photography because it's a lot easier to shoot with than a 14 to 30 or a 16 to 35 millimeter lens. And it's also great for walking around. It's a lens that I'll always put on if I'm just walking around and I just wanted to take some handheld snapshots. But the shots don't have to look like they're taken with a 50 millimeter lens. So take, for example, this shot here. This almost looks like it's been taken with a wide angle lens because I've got quite a bit of foreground in the scene. But what it's allowed me to do by shooting at sort of 30, I think this was done at 34 millimeters, is it means I can bring that distant subject closer to me. So that hut in the distance, I showed this in last week's video, that hut in the distance can be brought closer to me, whereas I can still get some foreground in the scene as well. And I can still, at 34 millimeters, get everything in focus in one shot. Again, with this shot here, I'm bringing this mid-ground of this rock closer to me by shooting at about 35 millimeters, still get some foreground, and the mountains in the background become part of the scene as well. But I'm cropping in on it a little bit, I'm making it a little bit tighter, and that means it's much easier to compose the scene because you're not trying to include so many things in your shot. You know, if we go a little bit further, this shot here was shot with 40mm. Again, I'm allowing myself to bring those mountains closer to me. These mountains, the Langdale Pikes, when you're shooting from home fell, are a long way away in the distance. And if you shoot super wide, then they look too small, if I'm honest. So by shooting at sort of 40, 50mm, you can bring them closer. You can still have a little bit of mid or foreground in your scene, and it creates a nice vista scene still. It still looks like a vista, but you're using some of those mid-range focal lengths. Now, the other thing I'd say about those mid-range focal lengths is they are fantastic for shooting woodland, because in woodland photography, most of the time you want to get everything in focus, but you're not too worried if maybe some of the trees at the background of the woodland are out of focus, because that can give a little bit of a sense of depth. And certainly, like me, if you're shooting in fog all the time, because I love shooting woodland in fog, like the other day when I was in the Peak District trying to find a composition with the heather, then I was shooting around about sort of 40, 50mm, and I didn't mind too much then, even though I was shooting at f8, knowing that when I focused on that tree in the foreground, that I'd still get a little bit of drop off of focus going back, because I'm not bothered if those trees in the background are out of focus. What I care about most is that first tree is in focus. So by having that mid-range focal length, I can control that composition really well and tell a great story. In fact, one of my favourite photos of the year, Enchanted Oaks, when I went down into the woodland and took this shot, was taken at 40mm. Now this looks a little bit like a wide angle shot, but it was taken at 40mm, and the reason I did that is because I didn't want to include the sky. Often when I'm shooting woodland, I don't want to include the sky, so by shooting a little bit tighter, maybe moving further back in the scene, and shooting a longer focal length can massively help you fine-tune that composition. So really think about that. When you've got your camera, I was going to grab this and shoot a camera, but that looks weird. But when you've got your camera, just rather than standing where you are and shooting at say 30mm, think, if I move back 5 yards and then shot at 35 or 40mm or 50mm, that'll allow me to sort of narrow down my field of view and focus in a little bit more, and that quite often can massively help your composition. Remove the sky, remove some untidy foreground that you don't want, or remove some buildings or trees at the left or right that maybe you don't want in your scene. So you've got to use your feet when you're using a longer lens. You've got to start to move a little bit more. So here's a couple of other examples of woodland photography that I've shot with different focal lengths.
We may have it all, up the ladder, down the wall, different mysteries, full life mixed with tears. We are happy most of the time.
I hope you like those woodland photos. If you like this video, then please give it a like. It massively helps me. It helps promote the video on YouTube, and I really appreciate it. So give it a like, and if you enjoy the content and you're not subscribed, then consider subscribing just below here somewhere. Okay, onto the longer focal lengths. So the sort of 70mm and above. These are really interesting focal lengths, and I'd say that if you're struggling with your landscape photography, you're struggling with a bit of creativity, then just get your 70-200 lens if you've got one, or maybe you've got a 24-200mm lens, and start shooting at the longer end of that. And you'll find it really interesting, and you'll start to find compositions that you just didn't know existed in landscapes. Right at the beginning we showed that landscape that was shot at 40mm and then closer in, and all the different compositions that were in it. If you start looking closer in and finding bits of detail in the landscape, then you'll be amazed at what you find, and it can be a much easier experience than trying to shoot wide. So yeah, so I pick out details, still create a Vista type look if you're shooting at the shorter end of that 70-200, like 70mm, like this one here in the Lake District with this amazing light. I just like the trees at the bottom, so I kept those in, just balance the scene, and then your eye sort of leads up into it. But that was shot at 70mm from the other side of the lake. You know, sometimes I shoot at 70mm in woodland as well, and this one I shot James. Pops this being a model at the bottom right there, shooting in this stunning snow we'd had in the Peak District. But I feel that just getting in a bit tighter, that 70mm makes a difference. This one here was again at around about 80mm, shooting towards the Langdale Pikes, and it just frames the scene really well. I was allowed to control the composition with the swan, these reeds and the mountains in the background. And then you can go a little bit further. So if you look at this scene here, where there was these backlit silver birches, I shot this probably last week actually, in the Lake District. I was hoping for some fog, I didn't get it, but there was amazing backlit silver birches. And I started off, I actually had the 14-30mm lens on, and I took some shots, and I thought, actually, I need to go a bit tighter. And I ended up shooting at 140mm to get this shot here. And it's so much better than those wider angle shots, because those wider angle ones just have too much in. There's too much going on in the scene. Whereas this, I think I could have even gone closer, to be honest. But this is just, you know, it just narrows it down. It makes a tighter and more pleasing composition. And that's really well explained by looking at this series of shots from San Francisco. So this was the Golden Gate Bridge, where I was there to watch the sunset, and I originally again had a really wide angle lens on, took this shot of the Golden Gate Bridge, which is okay, but it's a bit meh. It's nothing fantastic. But as soon as I put a longer lens on and shot, first of all at 90mm, you could see I got this, which is much more interesting. It's a much stronger composition. And then when I went even further, you know, I don't think it was a better composition than the 90mm ones, but again, it shows something very different. You know, I started to then focus on these people and a little bit closer on the bridge and the struts from the Golden Gate Bridge. And then when we go even further and we're pushing sort of the 200mm range, now I've got to admit, I don't take enough at that focal length. It's something that I'm really going to focus on in the next year, taking longer lens. My friend Mark Littlejohn shoots it all the time. I've showed his photos before. They are absolutely amazing, and he'll shoot 200mm up all the time. And he just hand holds everything and very rarely shoots wide angle. And it's something that I really want to do more. In fact, if I go back to one of the first shots I took on the predecessor to this 16 years ago, it was Suntree, and it was taken with 60mm. But I've taken a few shots at 200mm, but not enough. Like this one here from Iceland, where I just focused in on the sea stack. Rather than getting all the sea stacks, I went really close, waited for a wave to come, and then I could see the detail of the birds going around the sea stack. I could see the detail of the wave breaking, and it just creates more drama in the shot by going closer. And again, it allows you to pick out those small compositions that often exist in that big vista. So I hope you enjoyed that. Before I show you the focal lengths that I shoot the most from my portfolio, I just want to thank Squarespace for sponsoring this week's video. They're an amazing platform if you want to go and create a website. So as a photographer, having a website is a fantastic thing, because at the end of the day, we take photos and it's great to share those photos. What Squarespace allows you to do is choose from a range of amazing award-winning templates. You can set that website up with no technical experience, and it's super easy to do. So if you want to go and check it out, then you can go to squarespace.com, and if you're ready then to launch your website and you want to get 10% off, then you can go to squarespace.com/Nigel or use offer code Nigel. Okay, on to focal lengths. It's really interesting looking at the focal lengths. So in Lightroom, if I look at my portfolio then and look at the sort of wider range, so the sort of 14 to 17mm range, then around about 120 of my portfolio shots are shot in that range. If I looked at the 24mm, around the 24mm range, I think I looked at 23, 24 and 25mm. What was really interesting is I took so many shots just at 24mm. And I think that's because when I put my 24 to 70 on, I just go like that and shoot at 24, and that's probably not a good idea. I probably should think, you know, if I just go a little bit tighter, is that going to help? But anyway, I shot at that range around about 156 of my portfolio shots. In the 70mm range, about 90 of my portfolio shots were shot at the 70mm range, and at the greater than 100mm range, then about 150. But that's a huge number of focal lengths. So I'd say the most popular was around about the 24mm range, which surprised me actually. I thought I'd have shot a lot more at super wide 14mm. But I think it shows just how difficult it is to shoot at those ultra wide angle focal lengths. I quite often shoot at those, but I think when I get home and look at them, I'm more often disappointed than pleased. Whereas when I'm shooting at 24mm or longer, I think I have more successes than at that wide angle focal length. So that's interesting. In terms of my favourite, I think my favourite is either end, so 14mm or 200mm, because I think that you can create something a little bit more dramatic, a little bit more creative, and I think it's more fun to shoot at those far ends of it, but I don't think it's easier at that 14mm end. Anyway, that's it for today. Today's the last day you can pre-order my calendar. I thought I'd just mention that. So if you do want to pre-order it, then today is the last day. They'll be closed after today, and also the last day to get free delivery anywhere in the world, and entry into the golden and silver tickets for a one-to-one workshop with me. Okay, thanks ever so much for watching. Until next Sunday, bye.